Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. He was called a man of certainty, in tribute to the deeply held convictions that underlay the bold sweep of his political vision. As 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson pursued an agenda that brought the nation confidently into the first rank of world powers. His achievement drew upon closely held bedrock principles and a faith in the power of the intellect to effect change in public life. These gifts were magnificently on display in the progressive achievements of his administration. Yet they were sadly withheld from issues like civil rights and women's suffrage, where his commitment failed. Yet in the scope of the challenges he faced and the thoughtful approach to governance he embodied, Woodrow Wilson leaves us the legacy of a landmark presidency, one of ideas in action, and one that still endures. My guest is John Milton Cooper, E. Gordon Fox Professor of American Institutions at the University of Wisconsin and Public Policy Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. John, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
John, it's an absolute honor to discuss Wilson with one of his most eminent biographers, and let me take advantage of that to ask you this first and I think perhaps fundamental question. He was a self-defined son of the South.
George, that's an interesting relationship. His roots in the South were, and in America in fact, were quite shallow. He is the only president we've had since Andrew Jackson to have a foreign-born parent.
Right.
And the only one since Jackson to have no American-born grandparents. His mother was born in England, and then her family came to Ohio. His father was from Ohio, and they had moved to Virginia 3 or 4 years before he was born.
Right.
So, but then that he did though. He was raised in the South. My sense though is that there's always, I don't think he's that deeply rooted a Southerner. And his attitudes, even on race, are not quite the same as most white Southerners at that time.
Let's probe that, okay. And that might explain something that I think you've written very perceptively on. In that connection, for example, I know that, and he said, I think I can quote him directly, because I love the South, I rejoice at the failure of the Confederacy. That certainly is not a typical Southern attitude.
No, and he said that. He said that the first time he said that was 1881. I mean, that's only 16 years after the end of the Civil War.
That's right.
I mean, that's a rather gutsy thing to say for a young Southerner to say at that time.
And in his saying that, John, I got the impression that he was strongly rejecting that the belief in states' rights, which was at the heart of the Confederate enterprise.
He once said, he wrote in a letter, he said, ever since I've been old enough to have political convictions of my own, I've been a Federalist, meaning a Hamiltonian centralizer. And he wasn't exaggerating. I mean, from the time he's in college, he's already rejecting state rights and decentralization. He's very much a centralizing nationalist in his thinking.
And these are themes we will see consistently through his life.
That's correct.
As governor of New Jersey and as president of the United States.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Now, on the other part of this, or at least one of the other parts of this Southern heritage notion, and I think you are very right about the Anglophilic roots of his past. We obviously have to confront the issue of slavery. Now, here, John, help us understand this, because Wilson has been, and very rightly, criticized for being absent, really, in questions of civil rights later in his presidency.
He sure was. Absent's a good word for it, George.
He did reject and criticize slavery, but I got the impression it was more on the economic impediment it offered to industrialization.
That's right. That was a fairly common argument, even among some of the more so-called enlightened Southerners of that era, which was that, well, we were relieved of an incubus of slavery, not so much because of the damage it did to the African Americans, but because of the damage it did to economic progress in the South. You know, it was a retarding influence, and we're well rid of it.
But in precisely that, because when you read the totality of his life and you see as the way things played out later, perhaps missing the moral revulsion or not addressing the moral aspect was something that would cost him later. In terms of
it did.
Things undone.
It did. And as president, there's one time, and to me there's a fascinating might have been, finally, in 1918, he issued a statement against lynching. It's a very powerful statement, something like goes to the effect, any anyone who participates in a lynch mob betrays America. You know, that this is wrong. And it's a wonderful statement. And you know, what a powerful civil rights president he could have been.
Could have been, yeah.
If he, and that's the only time he ever did it, though. The only time.
Yeah. John, you know, we're talking about the president who would gain a PhD, become clearly our most intellectual president, and be driven by ideas throughout his public life. I want, with your help, to go back into the earliest origins of that, his school years, actually. Not just his school years, but, well, let's talk about Davidson and Princeton, his college years. It seems to me he's developing at that point very actively his lifelong belief in oratory, and he was a magnificent speaker, the last one to write his own speeches.
That's right.
As I understood
That's right.
And also his belief in public education. Now, I'd love for you to comment on both those aspects.
Well, oratory, that comes particularly from his father. His father, he said, my father was the greatest teacher I ever had. Now, of course, that's, you know, loyal son there, but there's more to it. He really did believe that. I mean, and the way that Joseph Wilson, his father, worked at training, and Tommy, by the way, he was called Tommy up until he was up in his early 20s, and the way he worked at that, but not in a you know, drill master way. I mean, some of that, but a very loving, positive kind of way. So it's a wonderful thing there. So he comes to that very early, to speaking and to writing. Although he liked writing just as much as he did speaking. Yeah. Public education. You know, we used to think, well, oh, that's public schools. Well, now he meant educating the public.
The public, exactly.
You know, educating them about ideas. He liked to appeal to emotions too, but not primarily. He thought what we need to have is informed, rational politics.
Right.
We need to, you know, you need to draw people forth to good ideas, draw them forth out of their ignorance. I mean, it goes back to, in fact, the Latin root of the word education, to draw forth there. Yeah. And
for that reason, John, or is it for that reason that he would become such a believer in taking his case to the public?
Oh yes.
Which we will see him do as president.
Exactly. He liked to campaign because he saw this as the way of reaching the public, but he also had, you know, kind of like the Greek mythical figure Antaeus, who was supposed to gain his strength from contact with the earth. Well, he thought he gained his strength from contact with the people, and he really liked to do that. He didn't just put it on; he liked to do that.
You've suggested this already, John, in your first comment about his ancestry, but he was very drawn, I think, throughout his life to British models. Or at least I got impressed by them.
He was, but I think we have to be very careful about that. He wasn't that much of a sentimental Anglophile. He wasn't drawn to them because they're British. They're, you know, bowing down and worshiping at Westminster or something like that. He thought that they did it better than we did. He particularly thought the parliamentary system, in terms of being efficient and accountable, did a better job than our separation of powers. In fact, he never liked the separation of powers.
Actually, didn't he advocate bringing the cabinet into
He wanted to
Congress?
he had ideas of having cabinet members appear on the floor of the Senate, maybe have honorary seats in the Senate, something like that. Now, as he got older and as he studied more, he got away from those overt things. But I think that was his model for the presidency, was to be able to bridge the separation of powers. The physical way of doing, the symbolic way of doing it, of course, was he revived the custom that Jefferson had abandoned of the president speaking directly to Congress, appearing before Congress. Washington and Adams had done it, and he revived that, and actually some of his own party members criticized him for it. That's symbolic, but he worked with the Congress, and especially he worked through the party. I mean, he believed in political parties as a political scientist, and he put those ideas to work.
And maybe those ideas, maybe is not needed here. Perhaps indeed those ideas were very well brought out, and he wrote many books, but perhaps his best book was written at age 28, just shortly after college. It's called Congressional Government.
That's right.
And it seems to pretty much say what you just said.
What he did, it's a criticism of the way, essentially the way he believed Congress didn't work. That he thought it was dominated by committees, and everything was done behind the scenes, and that what he wanted to do was bring debate into it. The president is actually not quite missing from congressional government, but he doesn't think the president has too much of a role to play there. And one of the favorite sports for political scientists and students ever since has been comparing what he said in congressional government then with what he did as president.
Right.
But well before he got to the White House, he'd already begun to see the power of the presidency and the potential. So he'd been changing his mind there quite a bit.
John, the first power of the presidency that he saw, and the first limitation on the powers of the presidency that he saw, was when he was president of Princeton University.
Yes, indeed.
And this is one of the most extraordinary episodes in any president's life, because here we have a man, I think it's unthinkable perhaps in our own times, who will, in a sense, leverage that experience for public acclaim that will lead to later chapters of his life. But what does the Princeton experience precisely mean to his career? I mean, what does he, because he really wants to reform, he did lead Princeton in the first rank of universities.
That's right, he did, yeah.
So educational reform was a big point of his.
George, it's his first experience with leadership. And it really gives him a chance to be a leader. Now, obviously, it's a very small world to jump from Princeton. Well, first he's got governor in between, but to jump from the Princeton presidency to the White House is a big leap. But it did give him his experience with dealing with people with various kinds of persuasion. We know Wilson is a great orator, which he was. He also could be extremely persuasive one-on-one. And the people, particularly the people he recruited to Princeton faculty, keep talking about that. And but I think the main thing it gave him, though, was visibility. As you said, he became the most famous college president in the country. I mean, he really became a public figure.
Right.
And that in turn made him attractive to power brokers within the Democratic Party, that they saw, aha, there's an interesting new face. And it gave him the exposure. I think the visibility was the main thing that Princeton gave to him.
And the first way in which that would manifest itself was the move in support of him for governor of New Jersey.
That's right.
Which he
that's an irony, though, because he'd already begun to espouse progressive reform ideas, but it was the bosses. And they thought, hey, we got a nice, attractive figure, a little bit of glamour at the top of the ticket to help us carry the election, and then we'll be able to control this guy, this ivory tower professor. And oh boy, they had a tiger by the tail.
They did, and I think one of the reasons, John, is why he'd been through the wars with that, and the Princeton fight was really quite bitter. There's people may not generally know this, but the university fights can be among the most.
Well, in fact, he used one of the questions he would get first when he ran for governor and again for president was. The reporters tried to be as polite as they could be. It was, hey, Doc, how is it that an ivory tower academic like you does so well in real politics? And he had an answer for him. He said, listen, after academic politics, the real thing is so much easier and nicer and more honorable.
Right.
Yeah.
What is he doing as governor that's going to influence the course of his presidency? I think he comes in with one of his strong planks or beliefs is the Public Service Commission.
Yeah, he does a Public Service Commission.
So is he becoming a progressive? Is he defining himself as that?
Oh yeah, he was already very much so. I mean, from the get-go. George, I think one of the things that he did as a model for the presidency was, and this sounds kind of simple, but nobody had done it before. He sat down and planned his legislative program in advance.
Yes, he did.
And no governor had ever done that before. La Follette sort of in Wisconsin, but not quite the same way. And then in turn, he does that when he's president. He's got his new freedom agenda. He plans it. He plans what to do when, kind of strategic shots there. It was the planning, and then of course, as you said, the appeal. At one point the legislature had stymied him, so he went out and appealed over their heads. He did that as president twice. We know with the League of Nations, with sad, even tragic results. But he'd done it earlier in 1916 when he had a program to build up the armed forces.
He had a preparedness program.
Right, and he was being stymied, actually stymied mainly by people in his own party. And what he did, it was an interesting tactic that he had. He went out on a speaking tour. We'd call it consciousness raising now, in other words, to educate the public about the stakes here and so forth, not necessarily giving very detailed speeches about it. So that's kind of whipping up that. That's a little bit of the stick on Congress. Right. But then there was a carrot. He came back and made a major concession, a major compromise, and it fell together beautifully. And
right. A man of ideas and a skilled politician in one swoop. Educating the public in those instances, again, going back to the earlier belief he had in that.
The other place, I think, the wonderful place that comes out is in the 1912 campaign.
Yeah.
When he ran against Theodore Roosevelt, I hate, well, I'll say it, as far as presidential campaigns go, I think that's as good as it gets.
I think you should emphasize that, John, because we're in the midst of one that is remarkable in its own right. But as a campaign of ideas versus it looks to me like that might have been the champion.
It was because he and Theodore Roosevelt really.
Well, you had the new freedom versus the new nationalism.
That's right. And it was, they tried to emphasize, on the one hand, Roosevelt tried to say, Wilson's an insincere progressive. He doesn't really believe in big government. By the way, that's how different it was then. You could diss a politician by saying he doesn't really believe in big government.
Right.
And Wilson answered it beautifully because yes, he did, because he always had. And in turn, Wilson tried to hit Roosevelt as basically wanting just to regulate the trusts and not bust them up, which it turned out they both kind of offset each other on that. But what it came down to, I think, were real philosophies of leadership and notions of human nature. TR, even though he was probably something of a religious skeptic, nevertheless had kind of, I think, a very standard Judeo-Christian notion of inherent human sinfulness and weakness, and therefore what you've got to do to make people, you've got to make people better than themselves. You've got to inspire them. You've got to evangelize them. He's the one, by the way, who called the presidency a bully pulpit, not Wilson. Wilson actually didn't like that evangelical model there. Wilson, on the other hand, is operating from the assumption that people actually are good, you know, not perfect, but good. And what you need to do is give them chances to realize their potential, to do their own thing. And so that's nationalism versus freedom. I mean, those words are well chosen, actually.
Well chosen, well enacted, well worked out, and in fact, they resulted in that a very successful, I mean, that after he takes office in 1912, it seems to me he has a real sweep, does he not, of legislative triumphs along these lines?
He does. And in fact, we've had three great legislative presidents, Wilson, FDR, and LBJ. And contrast Wilson with those two. FDR had the greatest domestic national emergency we've ever had, and basically a blank check from Congress for his first term. LBJ had spent his entire life, adult life anyway, on Capitol Hill. I mean, he mastered the Senate. He knew it inside and out. And he had, Wilson, on the other hand, is 2 years removed from private life.
That's right.
And I think for him to bring off those legislative feats is really quite extraordinary.
As a postscript or a counterpoint to that, though, John, I think in fairness, and you certainly do this in your writing, bring up the fact that some of his old failings do haunt him here, though. One of the things he may not have done so admirably was his delegation of the people he would appoint. I'm thinking very specifically of Postmaster Burleson, who comes and resegregates the government, and of course that leads to a tag that's going to haunt Wilson. Well,
you know, that's the best thing and the worst thing he did as a president, as a model of presidential leadership, was to delegate. On the one hand, you know, he did the unusual thing of treating his cabinet officers like responsible adults, and guys who knew their departments better than he did. And you know, our model of strong president tends to be based on LBJ and FDR and a bit of TR, is really kind of a meddlesome bully. You know, somebody who's always stirring up things. And Wilson backed off on that. On the other hand, you're exactly right. What he did was, when he came into office, he had not only Burleson, but Daniels and McAdoo and Houston. I forget how many of them, but a majority of his cabinet members were Southern born. And a big issue in Southern politics, and the white Southern politics, was, you know, that you've got black men as bosses over white women, and then this kind of thing there, and you know, and there's even a kind of belief in the goodness and mercy of segregation, you know, that somehow by separating the races it'll make everything calmer and nicer, you know. Well, yeah. So some of them were saying, well, Mr. President, we'd like to try to introduce this into the federal workplace, and his attitude was, well, go ahead. He didn't initiate it himself, but he certainly did let his Southern cabinet members do it. Now, they backed off on the physical separation when there were protests by the NAACP. In fact, that's the first great protest campaign that the NAACP is able to bring off. But it became a much nastier place for African Americans.
You know, one of the great ironies, there are many ironies, we've just been discussing one actually, but another one is this. I believe that Wilson himself once mused to a friend that given his sort of deep baptism in domestic affairs, his strong sense of national politics, wouldn't it be ironic if he got confronted with international issues, and lo, they came?
He, in fact, that was a comment he made, just an offhand comment to a Princeton faculty member. He said, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign matters, for all my preparation has been in domestic affairs."
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and the irony of fate, we can think of that with World War I, of course, that's the huge one, but actually it's there from practically day one of his presidency. Because
the Mexican intervention.
Mexico was right there, yeah.
What did that teach him, the Veracruz invasion, so to speak?
It taught him, that's interesting, I think this really goes to, one of the most interesting things and most interesting misconceptions about Wilson. It taught him not to try to impose values and democracy.
Yes. Yeah.
Because he thought, well, I'll go in there and I'll help the good guys, and
get rid of Huerta, I think.
Yeah,
it was.
right, against Huerta, and a little strategic intervention at Veracruz will help. And what he found was that all the Mexicans rose up, and even the people he was supporting rose up against that. And pretty soon he began to see, this is a very profound social revolution, and the best thing we can do is stay back and let it take its course.
Well, quite frankly, John, not to flatter you, but one of the real gifts of the way you write on these things is that we see a Wilson who's chastened.
Oh, very
by
much
this.
so. Very much
and,
so.
And it's a very interesting, because again, thinking of the ethnic and racial attitudes of the time, I got the sense that in many of his later pronouncements, formal and informal, he evidenced a real sympathy for the plight of the Mexican people as a people.
Oh, very much
their
so.
culture and their suffering. I mean, he wasn't the ugly gringo that.
No, in fact, he said, he certainly said it. No, I think he said it for publication, that he thought the Mexican-American War of the 1840s had been a terrible crime against the Mexican people, and he was not going to repeat that. And he kept us out of war in 1916. That slogan, that really applied to Mexico.
Yeah.
That was, that's where he did keep us out of war.
And he struggled to keep us out of the World War I.
He did. That was agony for him.
Yeah, really, and you depict that very well. How the perceptive drumbeat of submarine warfare forces him to it. But one of the things, when he realizes that the handwriting is getting increasingly clearer on the wall, he kept, and I thought this was remarkable in terms of his internal consistency, a belief in something, an ideal, a double wish to make peace, keep America out of war, and had a peace without victors. That phrase.
Yeah, he did that. That was I think that's one. I think probably his two greatest speeches as president are the Peace Without Victory speech, which is January 1917, when he thinks he can mediate the war. He's got a real vision of that. And then 2 months later, the war address, which is where he has got to turn around and take us into war.
God helping us. God
helping her, she can do no other. That last phrase of that last sentence of his, that nobody else would have said that. And it is an exact paraphrase of Martin Luther, by the way. God helping me, I can do no other.
Exactly.
And I think what he's doing is really taking the Lutheran problem, which is how does a Christian live? Because a Christian is still a sinner. And you can't avoid sin, so Luther said, sin boldly.
Isn't that remarkable,
Yeah,
John?
it is.
And this is the beauty of biography when it's well written like this, because here we see a man who was not overt or blatant with his religious messages, principles, or beliefs, but they were so imbued in him that this would come forth. And what he wrote himself, again, that's important. He wrote that.
George, this is a guy, he never thought God was speaking to him.
He never would have said anything like that.
Oh, gosh, no, because this I think is, as you said, that's how deeply he's imbued with it, with Orthodox Christianity. Happens to be a Protestant variety, but I think a Catholic could be the same way, is that you know you're a sinner. You know that you're imperfect. We can only hope we're doing God's will. We can never presume that God has spoken to us like that. That's to somebody who really believes that, that's blasphemy.
Yeah. The peace without victors notion, John, his first idea of American mediation would have been as a neutral.
That's right.
Out of the conflict, but helping people solve it. But then, of course, we were in it.
Yeah.
And submarine warfare had an enormous amount to do with that, but we were in it. But did the peace without victor ideal, we see that reflected further on in the 14 points and in the League of...
Oh, yeah, very much so. What he was trying to do, it's the most difficult of tasks, is to wage a limited war, limited in the sense of limited in objectives, that you don't want to crush the enemy. You don't want to demonize the enemy. He still thought the best peace would be one in which, well, now he's going to have to be on the winning side, but he didn't want a crushing victory necessarily. And the 14 points, I think, were, they had several purposes, but one of them, I think, was another olive branch to Germany, saying, hey, by the way, you know, if you'd like to lay it down now, you know, we can still arrange something. You can still have something like peace without victory. It won't be so bad. And the problem was then that the Germans turned around and did the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and showed that, and that he briefly blew his cool on that one. You know, force without stint or limit. You know, but backed off from that again afterward, and was, you know, got back. And he tried very hard. I think he eventually the whole thing at Paris wore him down, and he did become harder toward Germany and somewhat vengeful, I think, unfortunately.
But if we take the better part of all of that, and the part that endured in what we still call the Wilsonian vision, it's fair to say that played an enormous part throughout the 20th century American politics.
George, it did, although I've often thought when I see the way people talk about, use that term Wilsonian, you know, Karl Marx once said, I'm not a Marxist, just Karl Marx. I think Wilson's ghost could say, I'm not a Wilsonian, just Woodrow Wilson, because when his name is taken, when that term is used to mean naive idealism or this wish to spread democracy by force, that's not Wilson. He was an idealist, but everybody was then. I mean, that was the atmosphere, the environment of American politics. So calling him an idealist doesn't say very much about him.
What would we call him, John?
I would call him a very chastened reformer, someone who very much a man of this world.
I appreciate that, John, and just as I appreciate everything you write.
Well,
a man of this world, a chastened reformer. Thank God he has such a great biographer.
Well, you're sweet. Thank you, George.
Thank you. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you have been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcnetworks.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week.
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center, features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.